We now discuss utilitarianism. As a recap, everything we have discussed so far is about consequentialism. Consequentialism evaluates the goodness of an action based on the result or the consequences. One form of it is hedonism, which is looking for the physical pleasure kind of consequences. Another form of consequentialism is utilitarianism, which is not so much based on the physical pleasure, but on the mental pleasure. However, some books would say that hedonism or the physical pleasure is part of utilitarianism. Hedonism is like a lower kind of utilitarianism. Anyway, I mentioned from the beginning that they overlap with one another depending on what author or what book we are using. Like Montemayor, he distinguishes two types of utilitarianism. One is individual or egoistic utilitarianism, or simply egoism, which is very similar to hedonism. And then second is social or altruistic utilitarianism, or simply altruism. According to individual utilitarianism, the norm of morality resides in the usefulness of an action for the production of temporal happiness of the individual. Therefore, an act is good when it redounds to the temporal welfare and happiness of the individual, and bad if it hinders or hampers this happiness. Social utilitarianism, on the other hand, is that type of utilitarianism which holds that an act is good when it is conducive to the social good or well-being. This is so-called altruism, as distinguished from the first, which is called egoism. As you may notice in those two types of utilitarianism, the individual is related to the physical pleasure and to hedonism, while the social is related to the mental pleasure and to the real sense of utilitarianism. So here we elaborate more what is utilitarianism. The paradigm case of consequentialism is utilitarianism, whose classic proponents were Jeremy Bentham in 1789, John Stuart Mill in 1861, and Henry Sedgwick in 1907. These claims are often summarized in the slogan that an act is right if and only if it causes the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Utilitarianism is consequentialist as opposed to deontological because of what it denies. It denies what moral rightness depends directly on anything other than consequences. Utilitarianism is a theory very much akin to hedonism. It makes utility the norm of morality, good that which administers to the temporal welfare and happiness of man, bad which obstructs or hinders or retards this happiness. According to the utilitarian view, the goodness or badness of an action would depend on the effects or consequences of the action. An act is good if and when it gives good results, if it works, practical, pragmatic, it, if it makes you successful, if it makes you attain your purpose, bad if it does not. Here we have two divisions of utilitarianism. The utilitarianism that we mean here is already the truest sense of utilitarianism, which is not a hedonistic one, because this already considers the happiness of others in majority or in general. Utility here is not just for the ego or the pleasure of the individual, which is the hedonistic type, but for the disinterested people, even the people not related to you. So the utilitarianism can be divided into two, act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism is the ethical demand which requires that man should act so as to produce the greatest happiness to the greatest number of people. Act utilitarianism is also called eudaimonistic and hedonistic utilitarianism. In act utilitarianism, the rule of individual and general happiness is applied to the particular act. Hence, given the foreseen consequences, the question is whether or not the particular act under consideration leads to individual and general happiness. An example for this is when there are 4 patients in the hospital needing organ transplant, a heart, liver, kidney, and eyes, and there is one healthy person compatible to those 4 patients. The act utilitarianism would suggest that one healthy person must be sacrificed for the greatest happiness to the greatest number of people. This is a cruel kind of utilitarianism under that consequences. Hence, they modify it from act utilitarianism to rule utilitarianism. Rule utilitarianism, on the other hand, holds that man should act so that the rule governing his actions will produce the greatest happiness for the most number of people. Hence, utilitarianism would instead consider whether the act under consideration belongs to the type of acts which, based on the common experience and tradition, are likely to promote general happiness, or the opposite. This case would not be the same to the act utilitarianism that would sacrifice one person even without the consent of the individual, because it looks at the general rule as a principle. Sacrificing an individual with no consent for the sake of others would not bear happiness for all as a general rule, because in the long run, all people would be anxious and scared if time will come it will be their turn to be sacrificed without their consent. Therefore, it will not produce a good consequences. We go now to the pros and cons of consequentialism. Here we have critical appreciation of hedonism and utilitarianism by Montemayor. Merits of these theories. Hedonism and utilitarianism explain very well the emotional basis and aspects of human actions. There is always some satisfaction accompanying the doing of every good act. Hedonism or utilitarianism, or the consequentialism in general, also explains well the reason behind the doing of action by most people, where there is no doubt that most of them are motivated in their action by their desire for satisfaction or happiness or the well-being of the self and also of the others or the common good. Here we have the problems of utilitarian morality by Articulo and Florendo. The strength of utilitarian theory as a theory of life lies in its emphasis of human welfare as the ultimate standard of right and wrong. This is like a two-bladed sword, however, it is its strength at the same time the source of own weakness. The utilitarian theory or the consequentialism treats everything as conditional and subservient to utility. Violations of human rights and other unethical acts become morally justifiable as long as they promote the utilitarian tenet of the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. It is difficult to imagine discrimination or corruption as morally good simply because it is made for the greatest number of persons to be happy. Another problem, many correctly argue that the most serious problem of this theory is its attempt to quantify human dignity, that is, the treatment of human beings as mere numbers, especially in the utilitarian calculation. The happiness of 50 persons justifies the denial of the happiness or even the life of one person. Human beings are far greater than mere numbers. Individually, they have dignity which must be treated with respect. The theory falls short in explaining or justifying the idea that the well-being of the individual or of the minority must be sacrificed for the interest of the many. Some question what gives many the moral right to violate and or to disregard the interest of the few or of the particular individual. There's no clear basis why the greatest number must always prevail over the interest of the few. This makes others think that the utilitarian theory or consequentialism lead to the tyranny of the greatest number or the tyranny of the majority. What happens to the less fortunate few if we always think about of the happiness and pleasure of many? The other problem of utilitarianism is its overemphasis on the calculation of casual consequences. Most of the time, life presents situations where we need to decide fast with with little room for calculation. If we calculate all the persons who will benefit and all who will suffer every time we make our decisions, we will all end up doing nothing, or we will find ourselves acting too late. We have here Defects of Hedonism and Utilitarianism by Montemayor. Both propose an earthly goal for man, namely the temporal welfare here on earth, whereas we have already proven the former thesis that the ultimate and supreme purpose of man cannot be found in this life. Both, in the second, both make or tend to make morality relative, since what is pleasant or useful to one may be painful or harmful to another, but relative morality leads to moral chaos and destruction. Both theories make morality extrinsic because they make it depend on the effect or on a concomitant factor of an act, whereas, as we have already shown, morality is intrinsic, that is based on the very essence of things and on the nature of the act itself. Hedonism and utilitarianism may mistake the indicative for the constitutive. They confuse the nature of the act and the effect of the act as they should mistake the symptom for the disease. There are still many things to discuss and many things to clarify. Nevertheless, having learned the beauty and the downside of consequentialism, all the more we need to balance this moral theory with our keen practice of critical thinking. That is it for today, and thank you.